The antiseptic scent of bleach and latex clung to the air in the emergency room, a sterile perfume Clara inhaled every day. It was the smell of controlled crisis. But the man on the gurney, whose presence seemed to shrink the already crowded bay, brought a different scent with him. Road dust, worn leather, and the faint metallic tang of fear. He was enormous, a mountain of a man folded onto the narrow bed. His arms a tapestry of faded ink and fresh road rash. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the tremor in his jaw. His chart read John Doe, but the patch on his cut-off leather vest, miraculously intact, said, Bear. He was a Hell's Angel. The triage nurse had muttered it with a sneer. A judgment passed before a single vital was taken. Clara saw something else. In the wide, haunted blue of his eyes, she saw not a menace, but a cornered animal. His left leg was clearly broken, an unnatural angle below the knee, and his ribs were likely fractured, judging by the shallow, pained breaths he took. Yet he made no sound, his stoicism a heavy blanket over the agony she knew he must be feeling. Other nurses bustled past, their movements efficient and dismissive. Another biker, another accident. They saw the vest and saw a liability, a potential for trouble. Clara, however, slowed her pace. She approached his bedside, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the clatter and beeps of the ER. Hello, she said, not looking at his chart, but at his face. My name is Clara. I'm going to be your nurse for a moment. He didn't respond. His eyes tracked the movements of a security guard standing pointedly nearby. Then his gaze flickered back to her. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture was small, but it felt momentous. It was permission. As she began her assessment, checking his pupils and gently palpating the area around his ribs, she noticed things the initial report had missed. Faded, yellow-green bruises on his upper arms, shaped like fingerprints. A silvery scar on his temple, old and thin, not the kind you get from a motorcycle crash. These were injuries of a different nature, telling a story that had nothing to do with asphalt and everything to do with something far more insidious. He flinched when her fingers brushed a tender spot on his abdomen, but his eyes locked on hers, and the message was clear: silence. He was a vault. The doctor, a young resident named Dr. Evans who was more concerned with his charting than his patients, did a cursory exam. Multiple fractures, contusions. Get him prepped for ortho and keep him on observation. Standard protocol. He glanced at the vest thrown over the back of a chair. And keep an eye on him. The dismissal was palpable. Bear was not a person. He was a protocol, a stereotype wrapped in leather. He was a problem to be managed until he could be discharged. Clara felt a familiar ache in her own chest, a pang of empathy that had often been called a weakness in her profession. She saw the humiliation settling over the big man's features as he was processed, catalogued, and judged. He was a giant, yet in this sterile, fluorescent world, he had been made to feel infinitesimally small. She adjusted his pillow, her movements gentle and deliberate. We'll get you some pain medication soon, she promised quietly. You just rest. He closed his eyes, a silent surrender to her small kindness. And in that moment Clara made a choice. She would not see the vest. She would see the man. The quiet of the room was shattered by the sharp, confident click of heels on linoleum. A woman swept into the bay, her perfume, a cloying floral scent, bulldozing the sterile hospital air. She was impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit, her blonde hair styled in a perfect, immovable helmet. She looked completely out of place and yet utterly in charge. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice a polished weapon. "Where is my husband?" Dr. Evans, passing by, pointed a thumb toward Bear's bed. "In there, ma'am." The woman, Sharon, descended upon the gurney. She took one look at Bear's prone form and her lips curled into a sneer disguised as a smile. "Oh, Jonathan," she sighed, her voice loud enough for the entire ward to hear. "Look at you. Another one of your little adventures." Bear, who had been drifting in the hazy comfort of a morphine drip, tensed. His eyes fluttered open, and the fear Clara had seen earlier returned, stark and immediate. It was as if a switch had been flipped, the quiet giant replaced by a man bracing for a blow. Sharon ignored Clara completely, placing a manicured hand on Bear's forehead as if checking for a fever. It was a gesture of ownership, not care. Honestly, she continued, her voice dripping with condescending pity, when will you learn? These ridiculous toys, this silly club. You're not a boy anymore. Each word was a precisely aimed dart. The other nurses, who had been studiously ignoring Bear, now watched with open curiosity. They saw a concerned, if exasperated, wife dealing with a reckless husband. They smirked, their earlier judgments confirmed. Clara saw a performance. She watched Sharon's eyes, cold and sharp as glass shards, as they raked over her husband's broken body. There was no sympathy there, only annoyance and a chilling flicker of triumph. The doctor said his leg is broken in 2 places, Sharon announced to the room at large, a storyteller sharing a dramatic tale. And his bike? Complete write-off. I hope you're happy, Jonathan. That's thousands of dollars down the drain. Again Bear's face, already pale beneath his beard, lost another shade of color. He tried to turn his head away, a gesture of retreat, but the pain in his ribs stopped him. He was trapped, physically and emotionally. Ma'am, Clara said, stepping forward, her voice low but firm. He needs to rest. Perhaps we could discuss this outside. Sharon's head snapped toward her, her eyes narrowing. For the first time, she acknowledged Clara's existence. And who are you? I'm his nurse. Well, his nurse, Sharon mocked, should be more concerned with his medication and less with my private conversations with my husband. She turned back to Bear, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible. They're giving you the good stuff, I bet. You always did like to escape, didn't you? A little bit of morphine and you can just float away from all your responsibilities. It was a masterclass in public humiliation. She was painting him as a deadbeat, a child, a drug seeker, all under the guise of wifely concern. The shame radiating from him was a physical force, so potent Clara could feel it from feet away. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, his gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling tile above him. He had built a fortress of muscle and leather and ink, but this woman, with her sharp words and designer suit, had breached his walls without laying a hand on him. She had taken his dignity and broken it in front of an audience, something far more damaging than a fractured tibia. The conflict was silent but brutal. Bear's silence was one of endurance. Sharon's was the quiet of a predator waiting for its prey to bleed out. Clara stood her ground, a silent witness, her heart hardening with a cold, protective anger. The system, the staff, the very air in the hospital had sided with the antagonist. They saw a problem biker and his long-suffering wife. Clara saw a victim and his abuser. Clara moved through the rest of her shift on autopilot, the rhythms of her work a familiar comfort against the disquiet in her mind. Changing 4 bags, checking vitals, charting notes, the tasks were a metronome marking the slow passage of hours. But her thoughts kept returning to the man in room 3B and the cold, calculated cruelty of his wife. The scene replayed in her head, Sharon's voice echoing with a chilling familiarity. It stirred a memory from deep within her, a memory of another strong, quiet man who was often misjudged. Her late husband, David. David hadn't been a biker. He was a carpenter, his hands calloused and stained with wood varnish, not road grime. He was a man of few words, his presence a steady, grounding force in her life. He communicated not with grand declarations but with the solid set of his shoulders, the gentle way he touched the small of her back, the quiet pride in his eyes when he looked at a finished piece of furniture. He was strong, but his strength was gentle. People often mistook his silence for aloofness, or worse, a lack of intelligence. Clara remembered a dinner party with some of her hospital colleagues years ago. Dr. Evans, then a cocky intern, had tried to engage David in a conversation about financial markets, speaking loudly and slowly as if David were a child. David had just listened, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. Later, Evans had pulled Clara aside. "Your husband is a nice guy," he'd said with a patronizing smile. But not much of a conversationalist, is he? Clara had simply smiled back, a tight, cold smile. She didn't bother explaining that David had spent the entire conversation mentally calculating the complex joinery for the custom library shelves he was building, a task that required more spatial intelligence and precision than Evans could possibly comprehend. She didn't share that David's silence was not an absence of thought, but a fullness of it. He didn't feel the need to fill the air with noise. His work, his actions spoke for him. That quiet dignity was what she saw in Bear. She saw it in the way he endured Sharon's verbal onslaught without retaliating, in the way he bore his physical pain without complaint. It was the strength of an oak tree, rooted and immovable, weathering a storm. David had been her oak, until a sudden, aggressive cancer had swept through him, felling him in a matter of months. In the hospital, he had been subjected to the same indignities she now saw inflicted on Bear. He became a case number, a diagnosis, his identity stripped away by medical jargon and the detached efficiency of the staff. He had hated the loss of control, the way people spoke about him as if he weren't there. Clara had become his fierce protector, his advocate, translating his quiet nods and the subtle shifts in his eyes to the medical team. She fought for his dignity when he was too weak to fight for it himself. The memory was a sharp, poignant ache. Staring out the window of the nurse's station, watching the city lights blur through a film of unshed tears, Clara felt her resolve crystallize. She had failed to save David from the disease that took his body, but she had never, not for 1 second, allowed it to take his spirit. Now, she saw another quiet man being stripped of his spirit, piece by painful piece. The system was failing him. Her colleagues were failing him. She would not. The memory of David's hand in hers, his grip surprisingly strong even in his final days, was a phantom weight. It was a promise she had made to him and to herself, to always see the person, not the patient, to listen to the silence. Bear was not her husband, but his struggle was a profound echo of a battle she had already fought. This time, however, the enemy wasn't a disease. It was a woman in a cream-colored pantsuit, and Clara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had to do something. The professional risk was immense, but the moral cost of doing nothing was a price she was no longer willing to pay. The pressure in room 3B became a palpable, suffocating force over the next 24 hours. Sharon was a constant, malevolent presence. She had a cot brought in, establishing herself as the vigilant, caring wife, a move that earned her nods of approval from the floor staff. But Clara saw it for what it was, a guard post. Sharon intercepted every aspect of Bear's care. When Clara came in with his scheduled dose of morphine, Sharon would hold up a hand. "I don't think so," she'd say, her voice sweet as poison. "He has an addictive personality. We have to be careful. He can handle a little pain. It's good for him. Builds character." She would then turn to Bear, whose face was tight with agony, and coo. "You don't need that stuff, do you, honey? You're a big, strong man." He would just stare at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tight Clara feared his teeth would crack. The head nurse, a woman named Margaret who valued protocols above people, sided with Sharon. "The wife has a point," she told Clara at the nurse's station, loud enough for others to hear. "We have to be mindful of over-medicating, especially with his background." The unspoken word was biker, and it hung in the air, thick with prejudice. Sharon also became his gatekeeper. A couple of large, leather-clad men had shown up, their faces etched with genuine concern. They were quiet and respectful, asking only to see their friend. Sharon met them in the hallway, her voice a model of gentle regret. "The doctor says he needs absolute quiet. No visitors. His system has had a major shock," she smiled sadly. "I'll let him know you were here." The men, unused to the polished manipulations of a woman like Sharon, had looked uncertain, then nodded and left, their heavy boots scuffing the floor in retreat. Clara watched from a distance, her stomach twisting. Sharon was systematically isolating him, cutting him off from his support system, from pain relief, from any shred of autonomy. He was her prisoner in a hospital bed. The psychological toll was becoming visible. Bear seemed to shrink with every passing hour. The formidable presence he'd had, even when broken and afraid, was eroding. He became utterly passive, his eyes dull and vacant. He stopped responding to Clara's questions, letting Sharon answer for him. "Does the pain feel worse, Mr. Johansson?" Clara would ask gently, using the name she'd finally gotten from his chart. "He's fine," Sharon would snap, not even looking at him. "He's just being dramatic." The community of onlookers, the other nurses, the orderlies, the doctors, remained silent. They saw the surface-level drama, the difficult patient and the devoted wife struggling to manage him. They saw Clara as an instigator, someone who was too emotionally involved, who didn't respect the family's wishes. She was chided by Margaret for hovering and told to focus on her other patients. "Mrs. Johansson has things well in hand," Margaret said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Clara felt a profound sense of isolation. She was on an island, watching a man drown while everyone else on the shore commented on the beautiful sunset. The pressure wasn't just on Bear anymore. It was on her. Every time she entered the room, she felt Sharon's hostile gaze. Every suggestion she made was shot down. Every look of concern she offered Bear was met with a wall of his engineered despair. The crisis was escalating in the suffocating quiet of that room. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of a human being, and the hospital, with its rules and its biases, was her accomplice. Late that night, during a moment when Sharon had finally left to get a coffee, Clara went into the room. Bear was lying in the dim light, a single track of a tear glistening in his beard. He didn't try to hide it. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes, she saw the last flicker of a dying fire. It was a look of absolute, bottomless despair, an appeal. He didn't have to say a word. She knew he had reached his limit, and in that moment so had she. The system had failed. The community was blind. The pressure had reached its breaking point. It was time for action. The decision, once made, settled in Clara with a strange, unnerving calm. The fear of losing her job, of professional disgrace, was a distant hum beneath the roaring necessity of the moment. She looked at the broken man in the bed, the silent plea in his eyes, and knew that the cost of inaction was her own integrity. She would not let him be extinguished. The plan formed in her mind with swift, dangerous clarity, pieced together from years of navigating hospital bureaucracy. The busiest, most chaotic time was the 3 a.m. shift change, a brief window when charting was being finalized, reports were being given, and attention was fractured. That would be her moment. Sharon had returned from her coffee break, smug and refreshed, and had once again settled into her guard post. Clara had to wait. For the next few hours, she performed her duties with a placid exterior, her hands steady as she administered medication to other patients, her voice even as she spoke with doctors. But inside, her mind was a whirlwind of logistics. She procured a wheelchair from a storage closet, hiding it in an empty alcove near a little-used service exit. On Bear's chart, she made a brief, deliberately vague entry. Patient exhibiting signs of acute anxiety, requesting fresh air. Escorted to courtyard per patient's rights protocol, it was a flimsy justification, one that would never hold up to serious scrutiny, but it might buy her a few precious hours. Just before 3 a.m., she approached Sharon. "I need to take your husband down for a late-night x-ray," she said, her voice a perfect blend of professional detachment. "Dr. Evans is concerned about a possible embolism." She used the medical term deliberately, knowing it would sound serious and authoritative. Sharon's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "No one told me about an x-ray." "It was a recent order," Clara lied, her heart pounding against her ribs. "We need to move quickly for a moment." She thought Sharon would refuse, would make a call, would unravel the entire plan. But the urgency in Clara's tone, the veneer of medical emergency, worked. Sharon hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. I'll come with you." "No," Clara said, her tone firm. "The radiology department has a strict no-visitor policy during sterile procedures. You'll have to wait here." "It won't take long." It was another lie, but a plausible one. Sharon looked annoyed, but she didn't argue. The moment Sharon was out of sight, supposedly heading to the waiting room, Clara flew into action. She went to Bear's bedside. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "Right now. Can you move?" Hope, fierce and bright, flared in his eyes, chasing away the despair. He nodded, his jaw set. Getting him from the bed to the wheelchair was an agonizing, silent ordeal. Every movement sent waves of pain through him, but he didn't make a sound, his breath hissing through his teeth. Clara, fueled by adrenaline, found a strength she didn't know she possessed, half lifting, half guiding his large frame into the chair. She threw a blanket over his lap, covering the hospital gown and the cast on his leg. She grabbed the plastic bag with his few belongings, his wallet and keys, and tucked his leather vest under the blanket. She wheeled him out of the room, not towards radiology, but in the opposite direction, down the quiet, dimly lit corridor toward the service exit. The wheels of the chair seemed deafeningly loud in the silence. Each corner they turned, she expected to see Sharon, or Margaret, or a security guard. But the hallway was empty. They reached the exit, a heavy metal door that led to a small, forgotten courtyard. The night air was cold and damp, a shock after the recycled atmosphere of the hospital. It smelled of rain and freedom. As she had planned, a taxi was waiting at the curb just beyond the courtyard gate, its light on. She had called it from a burner phone she'd bought years ago and never used, paying for it with a prepaid credit card. She helped Bear into the back seat, a clumsy, painful process. Before closing the door, she pressed a wad of cash into his hand. Every dollar she had in her wallet, nearly $300. "I don't know where you need to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But this will get you started." He looked at her, his big hand closing around the money. His callous thumb brushed against her fingers. For the first time, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble, filled the space between them. "Thank you," he said. It was just 2 words, but they held a universe of gratitude. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct, and she saw the man he was, the giant whose spirit she had just uncaged. Then he was gone, the taxi pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Clara stood alone in the cold, her heart a wild drum in the sudden silence. She had broken a dozen rules, jeopardized her entire career, and committed an act of profound, reckless kindness. The fallout was immediate and severe. By 7 a.m., the hospital was buzzing. Bear was gone. Sharon, discovering the empty bed, had erupted in a storm of manufactured hysteria and righteous fury. Her performance was masterful, a symphony of sobs and accusations that echoed through the ward. She accused the hospital of negligence, of incompetence, of allowing her vulnerable, heavily medicated husband to simply vanish. The administration, fearing a lawsuit, went into full damage control mode. An emergency meeting was called. Security footage was reviewed, and all lines of inquiry, all threads of evidence, led directly to Nurse Clara. Margaret, the head nurse, looked at Clara with a mixture of vindication and contempt. "I knew you were a problem," she said, her voice low and cold during a brutal interrogation in the director of nursing's office. "You couldn't leave it alone. You overstepped, and now this hospital is facing a major legal and public relations crisis." Clara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't deny it. She didn't offer excuses. She simply stated, "I did what I believed was right for the patient." Her quiet defiance only fueled their anger. The official narrative was quickly cemented. Clara was a rogue nurse, emotionally unstable, who had defied protocol and potentially endangered a patient. She was suspended immediately, pending a full investigation that was certain to end with her termination and a report to the nursing board. The judgment from her superiors was swift and absolute. But on the hospital floor, a different story was beginning to take shape, started not as a roar, but as a whisper. A young nursing aide, a boy named Leo who was often invisible to the senior staff, had been emptying trash cans near the service exit around 3 a.m. He had seen Clara helping the big man into the cab. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now, hearing the official story, he remembered the look on the man's face. It wasn't the look of someone confused or endangered. It was a look of profound relief. He mentioned it quietly to another aide. An old janitor, Miguel, who had been mopping the floors in the main corridor, had witnessed Sharon's confrontation with Bear's biker friends. He'd heard her dismiss them with false sweetness. He'd seen their faces, etched with real worry, not the theatrical concern Sharon displayed. He told one of the kitchen staff, who in turn told a phlebotomist. Whispers began to circulate, quiet and cautious at first, passed in supply closets and break rooms. They were fragments of a larger truth. The younger nurses, the ones not yet hardened by years of institutional cynicism, started to connect the dots. They remembered the cruelty in Sharon's voice when she thought no one was listening. They recalled the fear in Bear's eyes, a fear that had nothing to do with his injuries. They had seen Clara's persistent, quiet compassion, how she had tried to advocate for him through proper channels and been shut down at every turn. Their perception began to shift. The official story painted Clara as a reckless liability, but the whispers painted her as a hero. They saw her not as someone who broke the rules, but as someone who upheld a higher, unwritten rule, to protect the vulnerable. The judgment of their superiors was loud and public, but the burgeoning respect of her peers was a quiet, powerful undercurrent. The atmosphere on the ward changed. Nurses who had previously given Clara the cold shoulder now met her gaze with a flicker of admiration. Dr. Evans, who had been so dismissive, was seen looking at Bear's now empty room with a thoughtful, troubled expression. The community of onlookers, once silent and complicit, was starting to rethink their assumptions. They had witnessed the humiliation, they had seen the pressure, and now, in the wake of Clara's selfless action, they were finally beginning to understand the truth of the situation. The shift was subtle, an almost imperceptible change in the hospital's climate, but it was real. Respect was blooming in the cracks of the official condemnation. 3 days after Clara's suspension, the sound began. It was just after noon, the busiest time for the hospital's main entrance, with visitors coming and going, and ambulances arriving. At first, it was a low, distant rumble easily mistaken for construction or a passing freight train. But it didn't fade. It grew, deepening from a rumble to a roar, a visceral, ground-shaking thunder that vibrated through the concrete foundations of the building and up through the soles of people's shoes. Windows rattled in their frames. Conversations in the lobby faltered. Heads turned, looking for the source of the impossible noise. Nurses and doctors, patients in wheelchairs, and anxious family members crowded the large plate glass windows of the lobby. What they saw silenced them completely. The main road leading to the hospital, a wide 4-lane artery, was filled with motorcycles. They weren't just a group. They were an army. A rolling tide of chrome and black leather, stretching back as far as the eye could see. At the front of the procession, the iconic winged death's head of the Hells Angels was unmistakable. They poured into the hospital's sprawling parking lot, not with chaos, but with a chilling, disciplined precision. They moved in staggered formation, filling every available space, their engines a deafening, unified chorus. One by one, in a wave that spread across the lot, they cut their engines. The sudden, profound silence that followed was more intimidating than the noise had been. It was heavy, expectant. 100 men, big, bearded, clad in dusty, road-worn leather, sat on their machines, their faces unreadable. They made no move to dismount. They simply sat, a silent, imposing vigil, their collective gaze fixed on the hospital's main entrance. Panic began to ripple through the lobby. The head of security, a paunchy man named Henderson, began barking into his radio, his voice tight with fear. "I need all available units at the main entrance. Now. And call the police. Tell them we have a situation." The hospital director, a man named Wallace whose concerns were usually limited to budgets and board meetings, hurried to the lobby, his face pale. He looked out at the sea of bikers, at the silent, unwavering legion, and his composure cracked. This was a crisis beyond any he had ever imagined. The bikers were not aggressive. They were not shouting or making threats. Their power lay in their sheer numbers and their unnerving stillness. They were a force of nature that had chosen his hospital as its epicenter. They were waiting. The community that had been so quick to judge Clara, the institution that had condemned her, was now faced with the consequences of the world she had touched. The bikers were an irrefutable testament to the man she had saved. They were his brotherhood, and they had come not for vengeance, but for an accounting. Their presence was a question, posed in silence and steel. You dismissed one of ours. You allowed him to be tormented. You punished the one person who showed him kindness. And now we are here. The air in the parking lot was thick with the smell of hot engines, leather, and an unspoken promise of loyalty that the sterile, rule-bound world of the hospital could not comprehend. The Brotherhood had arrived, and everything was about to change. Director Wallace, flanked by 2 trembling security guards, pushed through the glass doors of the main entrance. He held his hands up in a gesture he hoped looked placating rather than terrified. He walked slowly onto the concrete apron in front of the hospital, the silence of the parking lot amplifying the sound of his own frantic heartbeat. From the center of the front rank of bikes, one man dismounted. He was no larger than the others, but he moved with an aura of absolute authority. His vest was covered in patches, markers of time and rank, but it was the one that read President that held the most weight. He was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and his eyes, when he removed his sunglasses, were a piercing, intelligent blue. He walked to meet Wallace halfway, his boots making a soft, deliberate crunch on the pavement. He stopped a few feet from the director. "Mr. Wallace," the man said. His voice was not a shout, but a low, calm baritone that carried with it an undeniable gravity. Cut through the tense air with perfect clarity. Wallace swallowed hard. "How do you know my name?" "We do our homework," the president replied simply. He gestured back toward the silent army behind him. "My name is Preacher, and these men are my brothers." He paused, letting the statement settle. "One of our brothers was in your hospital. A man you know as John Johansson. We call him Bear." Wallace nodded, his face a mask of nervous attention. "Yes, he discharged himself a few days ago." Preacher's lips tightened into a thin line. "He didn't discharge himself. He escaped. He escaped from his wife, and he escaped from this place, which did nothing to help him." The accusation was plain, unadorned, and devastatingly true. Preacher took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly, forcing Wallace to lean in. "Our brother, Bear, is a good man, quiet man. He was a contractor before a back injury took his livelihood. He met that woman, Sharon, when he was at his lowest. She saw a big, strong man, and she thought she could own him. For 5 years, she has systematically destroyed him. She took his money. She isolated him from his friends, from us. She broke his spirit with 1,000 tiny cuts, 1,000 public humiliations, 1,000 private cruelties. She convinced him he was worthless." The story unfolded in the quiet parking lot, each word a testament delivered with cold, hard conviction. The few staff members who had dared to follow Wallace out stood frozen, listening. "He had his accident," Preacher continued, his gaze unwavering. "He was brought here broken and in pain. And what did you do? You saw his vest and you judged him. You left him in the care of his abuser. You listened to her lies. You denied him medication for his pain. You turned away his brothers when we came to see him. You watched as she tore him down in front of your staff, and you did nothing." Wallace opened his mouth to speak, to offer a defense, but Preacher held up a hand, silencing him. "But one person did something," he said, his tone shifting. "One of your nurses, a woman named Clara. She saw past the leather and the ink. She saw a man in pain. She saw his fear, and she recognized his dignity when no one else would. She tried to help him through your channels, and you shut her down. You called her a problem. So she did what heroes do. She broke the rules to do what was right. She risked her job, her entire career, to give our brother a chance to live. She got him out of here. She gave him the money from her own wallet. She saved his life." He let that final sentence hang in the air, heavy and irrefutable. The truth, spoken so plainly and powerfully, was a stunning rebuke to the hospital's official narrative. It recast Clara not as a reckless rogue, but as a righteous savior. The reveal was complete. It wasn't just about Bear's escape anymore. It was about the systemic failure of the hospital and the singular courage of one woman. Preacher's gaze swept over Wallace and the other staff members. "We are not here for trouble," he said, his voice returning to its calm, measured tone. "We are here for an accounting, and to show our respect." A profound stillness held the parking lot in its grip. Director Wallace stood speechless, the biker president's words echoing in the space between them. The carefully constructed narrative of the past few days had been dismantled in a matter of minutes, replaced by a raw and undeniable truth. The security guards had lowered their hands, their expressions shifting from fear to a dawning, complex understanding. Preacher turned slightly and nodded toward one of his men. The biker, a man with a long, braided beard, dismounted and opened one of his saddlebags. He pulled out a small, carefully wrapped object and brought it to Preacher. Preacher took the object and turned back to Wallace. "We would like to see Nurse Clara," he said. It was not a request. It was a calm, firm expectation. Wallace, looking utterly defeated, nodded numbly and spoke into his radio. "Find Clara Ross. Bring her to the main entrance." Now, a few minutes later, Clara appeared, escorted by a bewildered-looking HR manager. She was dressed in street clothes, having been called in from her suspension. Her face was pale and she looked terrified, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The 100 silent bikers, her boss's ashen face, the imposing figure of the club president waiting for her. She thought she was there to be publicly fired, perhaps even arrested. She braced herself, her hands trembling. Preacher's hard face softened as he looked at her. He took a few steps toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. He held out the object in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his gravelly voice gentle. "We're told your name is Clara." She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He began to unwrap the object, revealing a piece of folded black leather. He unfolded it to show a custom-embroidered patch. It was a work of art. In the center was a caduceus, the traditional medical symbol of 2 snakes winding around a winged staff. But this one was different. The staff was a miniature steel piston, gleaming with silver thread. The snakes were chrome exhaust pipes intricately detailed, and the wings at the top were not the small wings of Mercury, but the fierce, spreading eagle wings from the Hell's Angel's own colors. It was a symbol of healing and of the road, of compassion and of untamable strength, woven into one. The chapter, we wanted you to have this," Preacher said, holding it out to her on the palm of his hand. "It's one of a kind. We call it the guardian angel. You saved our brother. You honored him when others dishonored him. That makes you family." He looked her directly in the eye. "This patch means you are under the protection of this club. Always. You ever have a problem, any problem at all, you let us know. You will never be alone." Clara stared at the patch, then up at his face, her eyes filling with tears. This was not condemnation. This was recognition. It was honor, bestowed by the very people her colleagues had dismissed and feared. Slowly, she reached out her trembling hand and took the patch. The leather was soft and worn, the stitching thick beneath her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. At that moment, a car screeched to a halt at the edge of the parking lot. Sharon jumped out, her face a mask of fury. She had obviously been called by someone inside and had come to press her advantage. "What is going on here?" she shrieked, striding forward. "I want that woman arrested." Preacher didn't even turn his head. He simply raised his chin slightly. In perfect, chilling unison, 100 bikers turned their heads and fixed their silent, collective gaze on Sharon. The sheer, unblinking weight of their stare stopped her cold. The hatred on her face dissolved into stark terror. She looked from the bikers to Preacher, to the humbled hospital director, and she understood. Her power, built on lies and public perception, was gone. Without another word, she scrambled back into her car and sped away, disappearing for good. The investigation into Clara was dropped before the last motorcycle had even left the parking lot. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the hospital, one born of reflection and respect. The thunderous arrival of the Hells Angels had shaken more than just the building's foundation. It had shaken the institution's certainty. The story of Clara and Bear, and the brotherhood that came for them, became a quiet legend, a piece of hospital folklore whispered among the staff. Clara was reinstated with a quiet, formal apology from Director Wallace. But the true change was not in the official records. It was in the eyes of her colleagues. The judgment was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding admiration. They no longer saw her as a soft-hearted rule-breaker, but as a woman of profound moral courage. Margaret, the head nurse, avoided her for a week, then one day left a single, perfectly brewed cup of tea on Clara's desk with a simple, handwritten note that said, "You were right." It was an admission that meant more than any formal apology. Clara never wore the patch Preacher had given her, but she kept it in the inner pocket of her work bag, the soft leather a constant, tactile reminder. It was a secret source of strength, a symbol of a bond forged in a moment of crisis. It represented a different kind of family, one bound not by blood, but by an unbreakable code of loyalty and honor. She continued her work with the same gentle compassion as before, but now her quiet strength was understood. No one second-guessed her empathy. No one dismissed her concerns. She had earned a level of respect that transcended hospital hierarchy. The community had been transformed, its prejudices challenged, its definition of strength broadened. One cool autumn evening, months later, Clara left her shift long after the sun had set. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, bathed in the orange glow of the sodium lamps. She was tired, a deep bone weariness that came from a long and difficult day. As she walked toward her modest sedan, she heard a familiar sound, a low, throaty rumble that made her heart stir. A single Harley-Davidson motorcycle was idling near her car, its chrome catching the lamplight. The rider was Bear. He was no longer the broken, haunted man from the emergency room. He sat tall and straight on his bike, the fear in his eyes completely gone, replaced by a calm, steady confidence. He looked healthy, strong, whole. He wasn't wearing his club vest, just a simple leather jacket. He watched her approach, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. He didn't dismount. He simply waited. Clara stopped a few feet away, a smile of her own blooming on her face. There was no need for a long conversation. Everything that needed to be said had been said in the actions they had both taken. "Clara," he said, his voice the same deep rumble she remembered. He nodded toward her. "Just wanted to make sure you got to your car safe." "Thank you, Bear," she said, her voice soft. He nodded again, a gesture of profound, quiet respect. It was a final acknowledgement, a closing of the circle. He twisted the throttle, and the engine's rumble deepened. Then he turned his bike and rode off, the sound of the Harley a powerful, comforting presence in the night air. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The sound of a guardian fading into the distance. Clara stood for a long moment, listening until the rumble was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the city. She got into her car, her hand instinctively going to her bag, touching the outline of the patch within. She was just a nurse, an ordinary woman, but she had earned the loyalty of a brotherhood and the respect of her community, not by being loud, but by being kind. Not by being strong, but by recognizing the strength in others. The night was quiet, but for Clara, it was filled with the lingering, powerful echo of honor.